Well, they used to say that 7 days was a long time in politics, but nowadays, 24 hours is a hell of a long time. So the podcast that you're going to listen to now, self and Jim Hancock, the Downtown Den Politics podcast, was recorded literally 2 or 3 hours before Labour decided to suspend its Rochdale by-election candidate, Azhar Ali. Nevertheless, I'm sure you'll enjoy the conversation that Jim and I had about that particular issue. Also, some of the other trials and tribulations for both Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. And we also take a look at what's happening in America and Joe Biden's presidency. Enjoy the podcast, and we'll be back again next week.
The past 7 days have not been great for the Prime Minister nor the leader of the opposition. Rishi Sunak followed up his ill-advised bet with Piers Morgan with a truly cringeworthy performance at Prime Minister's questions. Meanwhile, Keir Starmer finally ditched Labour's £28 billion Green Pledge and was inevitably met with a chorus of criticism with accusations of traitor and flip-flopper in equal measure. To add to his woes, disturbing words in respect of Israel and the Gaza conflict from Labour's Rochdale by-election candidate came to light, reminding voters of the party's challenge with antisemitism. But if you think it's been a bad week for messrs Sunak and Starmer, then spare a thought for US President Joe Biden. His senility is becoming a real barrier to his re-election and a boost to his Republican opponent, Donald Trump. Is it too late for the Democrats to select an alternative candidate before the November presidential poll? Welcome to the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
Just looks like bigoted woman.
Me and my friends sort of used to run through the fields of wheat.
You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
It will cost.
I know words, I have the best words, but there's no better word than stupid.
Well, welcome to our latest episode of the Downtown Den Politics Podcast. And I'm joined as ever by our political commentator, Jim Hancock. Lots of us to talk about as ever, James. And of course, we'll start with the Labour Party this week because we often start with the trials and tribulations of the Conservative Party, as is the want of the Tories at the moment. They seem to have this huge ambition to continually shoot themselves in both feet. But it's not been a great 7 days for Starmer. And I'll start close to home as far as the Northwest is concerned. Rochdale by-election, which is due on the 29th of February. And we were saying, I think a week, maybe 2 weeks ago, Azhar Ali, a person that is well known to both of us. I worked with Azhar when he was leader of Pendle Council. I was leader at Lancashire and leader of the Northwest Assembly. And obviously, I've continued to have conversations with him in his role now as leader of the Lancashire County Council Labour Group. And you, again, will know him well. So when these comments came to light that, Israel in some way orchestrated the attacks on its people in order that they could then go and pummel Hamas and Gaza, it struck me, first of all, as totally out of character from a man who I've known for many, many years now, as I say, and somebody who's always struck me as being very steady in his views of the Middle East conflict, if I can put it that way. And someone, of course, who came out really strongly to support Louise Ellman when she was having challenges with anti-Semitic behaviour within the Liverpool Labour Party. And she indeed herself has come out this week in support of Azhar. That all being said, Jim, he's in trouble and he's put the Labour Party and the Labour leadership in trouble.
Indeed. I mean, obviously, the background to this was Keir Starmer's determination to rid the party of anti-Semitism, so he must be absolutely furious. And there's no doubt at all in my mind that Azhar would not have been chosen as the Labour candidate if this had come to light during the selection proceedings. And just before I get on to other things, as far as I know, Frank, candidates for political office have to sign a declaration saying that there's nothing that the selection board always want to know. Is there anything that you should tell us that might bring the party into disrepute. And I imagine Azar was asked this, and this outburst came fairly soon after October the 7th, actually. So it's there in the background. So that's a very serious matter of, I don't know for a fact, but I mean, it looks like it. He misled the party if he was asked that question. It is extraordinarily offensive. I mean, we obviously, one of the most well-defended countries in the Middle East, Israel with its Iron Dome against missiles and its army everywhere, a well-guarded frontier. It was incredible, almost incredible, that Hamas were able to break through on October the 7th. And, there will be a time when Netanyahu will be held responsible for how on earth that could have happened. But to reach for this ghastly conspiracy theory is just awful. It's like that thing about the World Trade Center was packed with dynamite. There are these crazies out there, and Azar is standing to be a member of Parliament, and the Labour Party sort of response to this has been saying, well, he succumbed to a conspiracy theory, but I mean that goes very much against Azar's judgment. So it's a very, very unfortunate situation. Obviously, as everybody knows, technically, there's nothing that can be done now. He's locked into the procedure. I don't know whether the pressure is going to build. I mean, there are options for the Labour Party. They could say he's no longer our candidate. There was a precedent in Scotland where an SNP person was standing and couldn't be removed and carried on and sat as independent. So Azar would sit as an independent. And then there's a hint in a comment from Nick Thomas-Symonds, who's the front bencher for the Labour Party this morning, when he was asked, he said, yes, he's the candidate for the by-election, which suggests that he might be deselected afterwards. But the one last thing I want to say is on the political calculations of this. Of course, we have the spectre of George Galloway here, and it's difficult to read. I don't know whether Galloway's spoken about this yet, because he's a sort of conspiracy theorist man, and he might actually agree with what was Azar's former view. I mean, we have to, in fairness, say, Frank, that he did a categorical renunciation of his position, and that's apparently won him some credit with the Labour Party to keep him on. They say the contrition is complete, and he's going to reach out to the Jewish community, although they're reluctant to accept it at the moment. And we have Louise Ellman's words that, normally speaking, he was robust in this role. So it's inexplicable, and it's a tragedy, really, because it's going to mark any political career that he had.
Yes, and I think that it's easy to say the Labour Party have backed him, but they've little choice, because, as you pointed out, they can't remove him from the ballot paper. They could, of course, say, as again you've referenced, that he's no longer the official candidate, or he no longer has the backing of the Labour Party. But it is that spectre of a George Galloway victory that is probably placing pragmatism in the way of political principle as far as this particular issue is concerned. Undoubtedly, had this come to light 2 or 3 weeks ago, when there would have been an opportunity for the Labour Party to change their candidate, then they would have done so. That is, without question, what would have happened. I think the other point to make, Jim, and it's something that's been picked up by some of the commentators over the weekend, is that Labour, again, I think, a little frit of Galloway because of previous election successes he's had. I think in Bradford at one time, he got this bandwagon going. And of course, they called the by-election really quickly following the sad demise of Tony Lloyd, who died after what we think was a short illness. Tony, ordinarily, a long-standing member of Parliament, would have been afforded to have, some period of mourning and then his funeral and then the by-election. Labour Party, as I say, served the writ quickly. We understand, because they were concerned about Galloway, as I say, getting this momentum and having similar success to that he enjoyed in Yorkshire. The problem with that, then, is that the due diligence that ordinarily goes into selecting candidates for by-elections, because the scrutiny on a by-election candidate, and we've talked about this on the podcast previously, in comparison to a candidate in a general election when there's 600 odd seats up for grabs, is furiously picked over by the press, by the media, by opponents. And so, again, I'll sort of tease you a little. I recall you suggesting that Starmer had a preferred candidate, and you were sort of saying, yeah, it should be left to the local activists. It's democratic to let the party select these people. Well, I put it to you, James, this gives further ammunition to those people within central office who say, this is the problem. You allow local activists to select these candidates and they don't know what the bloody trouble they're going to get us into. And it's happened before, and no doubt it'll happen again. And this time it's happened to someone you and I know. But I was absolutely gobsmacked, James, when I read those comments. Absolutely gobsmacked. But the bigger picture, in a sense, Labour have got themselves into this mess because of that rush. And as I say, that fear of Galloway getting momentum into the campaign.
Yes, I think there's a compromise between us. I mean, I was seared by the experience of Mary Rimmer not getting the St Helens nomination, and they brought in Sean Woodward, which I thought was an outrage against local people. I think our compromise between us, Frank, would be that it should be for local people, but that there should be a decent period of time when thorough vetting is done and the people who are presented to the local activists to choose have been thoroughly vetted. And I referred earlier on to whether, as I've been asked, whether there was anything that would bring him into disrepute that he should disclose. I suppose it's possible that in the rush that wasn't done. I mean, it's supremely ironic because they don't want Galloway to get a bandwagon, and now, in a sense, Galloway's got a bandwagon. But I think it's very bad for morale of local activists if they spend their years ploughing the streets, handing out leaflets, and then they can't be involved in the selection of one of the most important things, which is a parliamentary candidate. That's my point. But your criticism is well made.
I mean, my problem with that approach to selection of candidates, to be honest, is that, and this isn't 100% the case, but I think it will be a general comment I've made, and I've seen it across the Northwest on many occasions, is that you have this obsession with local candidates. And unfortunately, local candidates aren't always the best people, not just to represent your constituency, but we do sometimes have to find shadow cabinet and cabinet ministers. And so, often what those people need to do is build strong constituency teams to represent the constituency and the residents who they represent. But they need to be given freedom and time to go out and campaign nationally and think of ideas and present policies. And so, maybe there is a halfway house and nobody's thought of it yet. But I do have this genuine concern that the Labour Party in particular, actually of all the political parties, have this notion that it's got to be someone local, it's got to be somebody who's knocked on 3 million doors over the past 20 years and delivered thousands of leaflets, when actually, often I would suggest there are better candidates out there. Well, and, there's a reason why sometimes people are local. Listen, I went, when I was a politician, I went up to Wigan. And I don't want to be disparaging about anybody who was up against me. But it was clear before I even went into the room that the local candidate was the person that you had to beat. And, by all accounts, and, I do try to hide my
disappointment
under a bush, my lights under a bushel, as you know. But no, by all accounts, my presentation was fantastic. I had a great record, as you know, of campaigning in Lancashire, the sort of seat down the road, and I'd delivered election victories for other candidates as well. But that local candidate thing. And so, as I say, I take the point that you're making, and we're stretching this discussion way beyond where I wanted it to go. But I do think that Labour Party are culpable themselves here, not just because the local party have selected a candidate, but for the speed with which they made that by-election happen. I'm sure there'll be many people in central office, and that would, by the way, wouldn't have been a Rochdale Labour Party decision. That would have been a National Party decision. So plague on all the houses, Jim. The final point I'll make on this particular issue before we move on to another big difficulty for Starmer this week, which was his ditching of his £28 billion Green Plan, is, surprise, surprise, how do we know about the comments and remarks that Azhar Ali made back in the autumn? Well, they were recorded, presumably by another Labour Party activist or Labour Party member, and then leaked. And leaked not at a time that would necessarily do the maximum damage to Azhar Ali, because that would have actually been during the selection process. Yeah, if you want to do Azhar in, then you stop him being the candidate in the first place. But to do maximum damage to the Labour Party in this instance. And, you know, again, a reminder, if anyone needed, from politicians that in the days of mobile phones and recording devices, you have to be so careful of what you say, the comments that you make, the throwaway lines on occasions that you may wish to indulge in. And my view of this, for what it's worth, and Azhar won't thank me for this in a sense, because it doesn't necessarily add up to the qualification of being a member of Parliament, but he's a people pleaser. And I think that the views expressed there are so far removed from what I would understand to be Azhar Ali's politics that I can only imagine he's been carried away with the conversation that was happening. And he's, as I say, tried to placate the room, which is a terrible mistake for any politician to make anyway. But as I say, Jim, the Labour Party doing a Labour Party candidate in, where have you seen that before? Oh, dear me. Right. Well, listen, I think we've covered, as I say, gone much wider in that discussion than I'd anticipated. Let's deal with this £28 billion climb down, and it's been a long time coming. And again, I thought your blog was spot on, James. It's not the fact that it's been ditched, because we've been expecting that, as I say, for a while. But why did it take them so long?
Yes, I said it was. It made Napoleon's retreat from Moscow look like a walk in the park. That was very badly managed. I did come down on the side of that it was in, because the Tories had made such a business of it. It was beginning to loom up once again as the double whammy, the sort of tax shocker that did for Neil Kinnock in 1992. And I also offer the thought that Labour's weakest point throughout its history has been it's been most vulnerable to attacks on its economic competence. And this is where Rachel Reeves in particular, because I do think she's been calling the shots on this one, has been absolutely iron steadfast in not giving the Tories any room for manoeuvre at all. And here was this gaping wound of 28 billion. Why was the price tag put on it in the first place? These huge numbers, it's like HS2, how many billions and then more billions and so on. These figures are relatively meaningless in one sense. So it was wrong to get stuck on a price tag. But the way in which it was withdrawn was very unsatisfactory. It will have disappointed the Green part of the party. It will have fed into the flip-floppery and so on. But on balance, I judged in my blog last week, and I'd be interested in your views, that the vulnerability of Labour to the Tories going on and on and on about it made it necessary to pull away from that and to put up the case, which I thought had some credibility, that the promise was made by Rachel in 2021, and an awful lot has happened since then, including Ukraine and Liz Truss.
Yes, and I think the word that I used in respect of the by-election situation in Rochdale, pragmatism, is what has finally got the Labour Party to make a screeching U-turn on an issue that, it's been like a constant punch from the Tories. I mean, every week the Prime Minister mentions it, the dispatch box, and then every minister that comes onto the television says, where are Labour getting this £28 billion from? And so the surprise for me wasn't that it's been ditched, but it's taken them so long. And the timing of it as you say, that listen, there were so many better opportunities for Labour to make that announcement. The Truss crash would have been the obvious one, but equally, the breakout of war in Ukraine, the conflict in the Middle East, all of these opportunities were offered to Labour where they could have come out and credibly said what Wes Streeting ultimately said actually on Question Time anyway, the day after the announcement was made last week. Well, the circumstances have changed. Rachel Reeves made that commitment in 2021. And let's be honest again, Labour were trying to outflank a very green Conservative Prime Minister, actually. So Boris Johnson, who was still PM at the time, had stolen a march somewhat on the Labour Party as far as the environmental agenda was concerned. And what Rachel Reeves was trying to do was put a flag in the ground to say, well, we'll be spending 28 billion quid a year, Boris, match that. And of course, subsequently, he gets into all his difficulties. The green agenda is swept away by the new Tory leadership. They're saying that this is far too expensive. It lacks common sense in terms of the approach we're taking. We've seen the ULEZ situation in the by-election in London become a big issue, which arguably stopped Labour winning that particular contest. And so you are spot on, Jim. Not surprising at all to see the policy ditched. Probably on balance the right decision, but why, oh why, did it take them so long to make that decision?
Well, what do you think about Ed Miliband? Did he put up a very strong resistance? I think he's done an interview since, but he wasn't present when Starmer was making the announcement. And I mean, it mostly concerned environmental matters, so you'd have expected the shadow environment person to be there. I mean, obviously he, in a sense, he's lucky to be in the shadow cabinet. He didn't make a great thing about being leader of the party. I mean, did he put up a very stout resistance, and was that the reason for the delay?
You can only go off the comments that you read in the press. I've no sort of feedback in terms of conversation that have taken place or otherwise, but you would imagine so. But equally, I think Keir Starmer thought that, on balance, this is a policy that he will prefer to have kept. I'm sure the same could be said for Rachel Reeves. Nobody doubts that, that policy in good days economically would be a positive one to promote. But given the financial circumstances, given the fact that the Treasury is running out of cash, then, as I say, I just couldn't understand why they kept hold of it for as long as they did.
Moving on to the more substantial issue of how business is going to react to this, because this is another classic case of business people will be tearing their hair out because they want certainty and they haven't got certainty again. There was a lot of jobs riding on this, and a lot of claims for how Labour was going to get the economy going around the green economy. Now, some of that's still in place, although I don't think a lot of attention has been paid to the fact that the pledge to insulate people's homes has been drastically cut back. That's where some of the money's disappeared to. But I mean, what do you think business reaction going to be to this? Here's another HS2, green agenda. Who can business trust?
Yeah, well, that's the problem, Jim, isn't it? It's this consistency or lack of that the business hate. And so, you mentioned HS2, and of course, the fallout from that has been far greater than has been reported in the press. It was a big story during the Tory party conference. It's gone away as far as media attention is concerned, but the implications subsequently have been huge for business and continue to be. And likewise, if you are within that green energy, that environmentally friendly industry sector, you would have been looking at that £28 billion commitment thinking, the UK is the place where we need to go and start to really motor, if you can forgive forgive that rather unfortunate term, I suppose, when we're talking about the green agenda. Nonetheless, the point that you've well made, Labour is so concerned about the double whammy, the fact that the Tories, as I say, have been just picking at this all the time, since the announcement, 28 billion. It was inevitable that it was going to go just took me by. So it just surprised me that it took them so long to get rid of that particular commitment. And I think what they will be saying is that they are still on the right side of the green agenda, the green debate, and they will invest when the time is right, when the economy improves. But you've sort of again referenced this slightly. Wasn't the £28 billion in the green economy the very thing that was going to give UK PLC the economic growth, the rocket fuel? Again, shouldn't perhaps use that term in respect of a green agenda. But that's what it was about, Jim, wasn't it? That was the sort of basis of Labour's economic growth plan.
Yes, to make us independent of Russia and people like that with offshore wind and mini nuclear power stations, and this massive program of insulating the nation's housing. I mean, if you think about the trades that would be involved in that, it's an absolute classic of a sort of, it goes back to the Roosevelt things in the 1930s, where Roosevelt made work, build dams, build highways, and then the people will be well paid, and then they can feed it into the economy and the whole thing gets going. And that I think is the vision of Rachel Reeves, but she scaled it back, particularly on home insulation now quite a lot. And then we get what the industry's reaction is going to be to it, because as you so rightly said, it looked as if UK was going to be right up front with a lot of this, and we're very good at inventing the sort of inventions about these things, and we lead the world in many ways in that. But it would have led to the training of people who were going to insulate our homes, training of more nuclear engineers and so on. But as Pat McFadden said yesterday, the Labour sort of election guru, he said, the private sector is absolutely crucial to this. He was sort of saying it so as not to make too much emphasis on the 28 billion, that actually an awful lot of it's coming from the private sector. Well, my question will be now, will the private sector still have faith in Britain, or will we see some of this work going to the Netherlands and places like that?
What it does tell us, Jim, is that Labour has decided upon the strategy is we couldn't do any worse than that lot over there. And as if to remind us of how bad they are, then the Conservatives last week scored 2 huge own goals, or the Prime Minister at least did, in a week that actually started off well for him. We spoke last week about the Northern Ireland Assembly now re-establishing and sitting for the first time in many years, and that Sunak can take credit for because of the new deal he's done with the European Union. But he followed that with the bet with Piers Morgan, £1,000, yeah, go on, shaking hands, which just looked awful. The optics of that looked terrible. £1,000 bet, the way you and I'd say to each other, well, I'll bet you a penny. Yeah. These 2 bloody middle class guys on television thinking that it was good laugh to not only throw £1,000 bet on the table, but trivialise the refugee situation in the way they did. I thought that was bad, but if anything worse was the follow-up, the Prime Minister's questions, when he makes this joke about Keir Starmer's approach to the issue of transgender, and the poor mother of the transgender teenager who'd been murdered about a year ago today in Warrington was actually on the parliamentary estate. Now, Starmer pointed out immediately, he was quite angry, actually, and I think, genuinely so, Starmer, and there was an opportunity immediately for Sunak to come back and say, didn't realise that was the case. The charge stands, you're still a flip-flopper, but of course, I have to be sensitive to that fact, and I withdraw that remark. Apologise. If not then, certainly when the father of the murdered teenager calls for an apology, you have to find the words to offer some sort of apology. And we had this conversation about Ed Davey a few weeks ago in relation to the post office workers. Why is it so difficult for politicians to just do the right thing on occasion and say sorry?
Kill it off. Yeah, kill it off, absolutely. The wider issue, I think, of concern is going to be, and we've discussed this before, that Sunak isn't a natural politician, and this has been shown up in spades. He hasn't got that agility. I mean, I presume that long tirade, which ended with that completely inappropriate joke, was written, and as he says, to point out what a flip-flopper Keir Starmer was. But, a politician would have left that last one off the list. There was a list, and all the other stuff was valid political comment about Keir Starmer's propensity for flip-flopping. But a politician with his wits about him would have left that off. And the same thing about the bet, when Piers Morgan's stretching his hand out towards you, you want to get them right behind you. And the problem with this is that he's going to face a general election campaign where you're out on the stump, you're meeting people, there are famous interactions with the public, the Prescott punch, of course, but there was also the case in Birmingham, I think in 2005, where Tony Blair, an astute performer, was nailed to the wall by a woman who had her husband had cancer problems, if you remember. So you're going to encounter the public, and you're going to have to be fast on your feet, fast thinking. And I think a lot of people, even the conspirators who we're told are waiting to bring Sunak down, will be pointing to this, saying there's going to be gaffes on the road during the general election as a result of this.
Yeah, and he's got bad news this week, as we understand it, on the economy to come. Inflation not looking great, interest rates stubbornly staying quite high. And then he's got these two by-elections, James, and two healthy Tory majorities at the general election, but we're anticipating a couple of defeats for the Conservatives on Thursday. What will that do to Conservative Party morale, do you think?
It's quite astonishing how they've been written off. I read a report in the newspaper last week where the reporter went to the headquarters in Wellingborough, where Peter Bone used to have his constituency office, and it was all locked up. They've chosen Peter Bone's mistress is an old-fashioned concept, but the lady he's with now as the candidate, which is odd.
Partner is the word, James.
Partner, I beg your pardon.
Okay, now, hey, I do apologise to listeners under the age of 100.
Which is an interesting choice. I mean, she may
9 people who Peter Bone is. Sorry,
Peter
listeners
Bone
who won't be as aware of the political shenanigans of Westminster as you and I.
Yes, well, Peter Bone used to be a rather lovable figure at Westminster because he was a right-wing Tory, very much in favour of coming out of the European Union. But whenever he got up, he used to say to David Cameron, Mrs. Bone is concerned such and such and such and such. And of course, Cameron once famously came back and said, my only aim in life is to pleasure Mrs. Bone, which of course brought the house down. But then he was subject to serious accusations about his behaviour and was found guilty by the parliamentary authorities. A recall petition was held, and that's why the by-election is taking place. And so some people were aghast at the Conservative Party's response to this. But I mean, it goes to this question of choosing local people again, Frank. That they obviously, this partner of his has a reputation for working well in the constituency, and she's the candidate. But 18,000, you think it's home and dry. But of course, we've had Selby and Ainsty and other Tamworth, where 20,000 plus majorities have been overthrown. So there's no reason to think that they won't suffer there. Kingswood is a slightly more marginal seat, but again, the Conservative MP just left. He had differences with the party over their environmental policy, but the irritation was
how ironic.
Why didn't he stay to the general election? Because these things cost about £250,000 altogether.
Yeah. So
I think there'll be quite very low polls. There'll be a mass Tory abstention, and Labour should take both seats. If they don't take both seats, that could be well. I mean, I'll brush it off saying they were Tory seats, but, the expectation levels are so high now that they are expected to win both. And if they don't, it will be a bad day for Keir Starmer.
Yeah, I think they are fairly confident, and not least because the Conservatives have hardly campaigned in either seat. So Labour have been hard at it, of course, knocking on doors, posting all those leaflets and so on, so very visible, as I say, as I understand it. So Labour will be expecting to win votes. Of course, they won't be saying that in the run to the poll. They'll be saying it's going to be touch and go, and these are two big Tory majorities that they're going to have to overturn. The thing, of course, that is interesting is that whilst the Labour Party are campaigning hard in those by-elections and spending a small fortune, the Tories are keeping the powder dry. And when you consider the spending limits for the general election have increased significantly, almost without comment by our wider media. And this, of course, will suit the political party with the deepest pockets, which, surprise, surprise, is the Conservatives. And I do know that Labour fundraisers have got the head in the hands every time one of these by-elections is caught, because, it just does take more effort for Labour to raise that sort of money. So these by-elections are really eating in to Labour Party's resource. So as much as they will want to win, I can understand why they're campaigning hard in both seats. As I say, I know that back at the ranch, the fundraising team are having kittens at the amount of money that is being spent on these contests.
Yes, well, without trivialising things, it looks as if they'll be saving some money in Rochdale.
Yeah, maybe. But again, and I've seen... we'll finish off on this.
I don't think you'll see many shadow cabinet members or Keir Starmer anywhere near Rochdale, do you?
No, I don't. But equally, I think the dilemma is twofold, isn't it? They can't stand Azhar Ali down because it's too late. But secondly, they will not want George Galloway to win. It's the toxicity of the opponent as much as it's about defending the seat for the Labour Party. And you said earlier that a shadow cabinet member's already said, well, he's the candidate for the by-election. You could be in this bizarre situation where he wins the seat of Rochdale in the by-election, and then he's almost immediately deselected because they're not going to have much of a turnaround time, which on a personal level, by the way, is a tragedy for Azhar Ali, who's worked really hard as a politician, done an awful lot for the community, has won an OBE or an MBE. He's won one of the honours for that work. And he spent, as I say, an awful long time trying to become a parliamentarian. He may be in there we don't know, this is all speculation, he may be in there for a short period of time. But again, I suspect that had it been, say, a Liberal Democrat unknown who was the main opponent in that seat, Labour may have just said, we're going to fall on our sword and leave this one, and we'll win it back during the general election. I saw a comment from Dan Hodges, Sunday Mail political columnist, saying that he thinks Labour ought to have done that because, what does it matter that George Galloway gets it? Well, George Galloway, a couple of months, 6-7 months in Parliament, can do an awful lot of damage, not just to the Labour Party, but to the country's politic more generally. So, be careful what you wish for, Mr. Hodges, is all I'd say to that.
Yes, and on the wider international aspect of this, of course, the United States is getting increasingly exasperated with Israel. So Keir Starmer sort of supporting the Biden line, if you like, that we want pauses and so on, but we won't go for a ceasefire. I mean, there's been further incidents overnight where Netanyahu, I imagine, the Americans just are not prepared to turn off the arms flow. Otherwise, he'd have to retrench. But it's getting pretty brinkmanship. Biden has gone almost as far as he can in urging restraint on the Israelis. And so, Starmer, there's a potential that because Starmer's under huge pressure from the Muslim influence in this party to take a stronger line. So we'll have to see what happens on the international front as well.
Yes, well, as always, James, your professionalism shines through in terms of your media experience, and you've given me the segue that was required to move into the second part of our programme. We're going to take a short break, and then we're going to talk about American politics and Joe Biden. Stay with us.
On April the 18th, 2024, Downtown in Business will be hosting our Changemakers Live conference. It's an absolutely fantastic event with an eclectic range of speakers looking at everything innovation, science, tech, health, sport, whole range of topics that we'll be talking about this year. So as I say, April the 18th, it's at the Spine Building in Liverpool. Book your tickets now. Go to our website, all the W's, downtowninbusiness.com, and register for your ticket today.
Welcome back to the final part of this week's Downtown Den Politics podcast with myself, Frank McKenna, Chief Executive and Group Chairman of Downtown in Business, and our political commentator, Jim Hancock. And we're going to go across the pond and to America. And if it was a bad week for messrs. Starmer and Sunak, well, it was an absolutely diabolical one for Joe Biden. James, what's happened?
Well, from what I can tell, there's been a continued deterioration in his mental health. The broader picture is that they think, Joe Biden has beaten Trump once, and he's the only man who can do it again, and that has to be the fundamental explanation for why they have, for so long, stuck with a man who's clearly struggling. To recall things, and it's. I mean, as we've said before, Biden's track record has been quite good. I don't know why he's failing in the polls, because the American economy is in pretty good shape. The infrastructure is being developed, and so from that point of view, he's doing a good job. Apparently, Americans don't feel it in their pocket. Apart from his, and I have to call it senility, the Mexican border has been a big weakness. And there was an extraordinary case the other day where the Texas government, which is Republican-run, put up barbed wire fencing, and the Supreme Court, which was interesting because it's full of Trump people now, ordered them to pull it down, and they're going to put it up again. And there's a big battle between the federal government and Texas. But, on Biden's watch, to be pulling down the barriers, because there are, it's virtually out of control, people coming over the southern border. So he's got weaknesses there. But on the broader picture, the Democrats have willfully not even, this is the problem. There isn't an obvious successor. That's another reason why he's still, I think, very much the candidate, because apparently the vice president, I don't have a problem with her, but apparently she's not electable. And there is the governor of Wisconsin and the governor of California. But beyond that, and they've not been groomed in any way for the position, which you'd think they would have been anyway, because, at the age of 80 odd, health can intervene, and it's merely good practice to have some succession planning, but they're in this incredible position now.
Let me just remind listeners that the reason this issue has become the focus of our attention again this week is that the prosecutor, a Republican prosecutor, I should say, said within a report that was basically following an investigation into Joe Biden keeping some classified documentation following his departure as vice president. So in the same way that Trump kept, documents in Mar-a-Lago, Joe had sort of forgotten that there were some files in his garage as well. But the Republican prosecutor, actually, it would have done Biden more favours if he had said, we're going to take him to court and we're going to prosecute him. Because what he actually said was, listen, this guy, he's an old fella, he's an old guy, and he didn't mean any harm. And when we interviewed him, he couldn't even remember the date on which his son died. And on the back of that, Joe Biden then calls a press conference in which initially he gives a really robust defense of himself and says, quite angrily, what the hell has it got to do with the prosecutor? What date my son died in relation to these documents? And at that point, had he just disappeared from the press conference, he was probably back to where he was last week, which is people still concerned about his age and his mental capacity, but no more than that. Instead, he bizarrely returns to the podium and starts talking about him being the one who convinced the Mexican president to open the border to allow aid into Gaza. Of course, he meant the Egyptian president. And so immediately, the very thing that he's denying he has a problem with, i.e. his memory and recall, is brought into sharp focus. And again, I can only assume, as you've suggested, James, that there is literally not one single candidate that the Democrats at this moment in time can get behind. I would say to them, if anyone in the States is listening, find someone quick, because not only is Trump likely to beat this guy, because although Trump is going to be 81, 82 by the time his presidency finished, if he was re-elected, he just looks more robust, doesn't he? He just looks fitter than Biden. Biden looks a frail old man.
Yeah.
And Trump, whatever else you think of him, doesn't look that. So the Democrats, for that reason alone, I think, again, from pragmatism perspective, should be looking for an alternative candidate.
I mean, and the other thing
what if he did keel over there?
Well,
Jim?
I mean, and think about the election campaign. Now, in 2020, it was an extraordinary campaign because of COVID. It was largely conducted with Biden was able to stay in his house. I think Trump did a bit of campaigning around the country, telling people to protect themselves with disinfectant. And Biden was able to do that, and that was 4 years ago. The normal presidential election run is notoriously exhausting. You're back and forth across time zones and the West Coast, the East Coast, Mid-America. And if he tries to conduct it from the White House, not get out amongst the people, that narrative that he's almost in a wheelchair is going to go on. I mean, I mentioned a wheelchair. Here's my historic reference for the week. Frank, I know you like one every week. Of course, Franklin Roosevelt, although he carefully disguised it with standing on his crutches and so on, was actually a cripple. And sorry, that's not the right word to use nowadays. I do apologize. But he was in need of a wheelchair. Throughout the 1930s, people didn't know about it. It obviously didn't affect him. He was a much younger man. But, now this is the television age. Every day the president's got to reveal his health records. So there's an issue about how this campaign is going to be conducted, because if Trump's all over the country doing his rallies and Biden's trying to conduct it from the Oval Office, or if he tries to go out in the field, the health event that we all fear could actually occur.
And James, unlike in the UK, where we have a debate about whether debates are going to happen, television debates between the main candidates, in the United States, no such discussion. They just happen. How is Joe Biden going to fare against Donald Trump in a head-to-head?
Yeah, well, Hillary Clinton, you should be in jail. And, Trump, remember Trump sort of walking around and all
behind her. Yeah, very menacingly. It's, for people like us who are somewhat concerned about the return to the White House of Donald Trump, and would wish that Joe Biden was a credible candidate to defeat him, I wouldn't be confident at the moment, James, would you?
Well, no, but I mean, let's turn to Donald Trump. This extraordinary outburst where and we've always known for a long time how exercised he is about the failure of Western European countries to spend 2% or more on their defense budget. And he came out with this extraordinary statement that, some guy came up to me and said, well, we're not, subscribing 2%. Will you still defend us? And he said, no, not only that, but let the Russians do what they want to your country. Now, it's on the road rhetoric, and we've been used to that. But, and with this extraordinary interview that was done by this sycophant last week of Vladimir Putin, who's a,
Tucker Carlson,
thank you.
Who's a big Trumpian.
Yeah, this sort of bizarre thing. And there is this. I was reading some analysis last week that the right wing of the Republican Party do have a sneaking admiration for Putin's, dictatorial power and all that sort of thing, and dealing with, with his problems with force and that sort of stuff. And so there's this dangerous sort of admiration for it, and certainly a lack of concern, it seems to me, for democratic values. So it's an unprecedented presidential election campaign we're in at the moment on both sides.
Yeah, the language was very unfortunate that Trump used in terms of the throwaway line at the end, almost, wasn't it? Of well, I'd just tell Putin to do what the hell he likes to you. The other point that he made was spot on. And NATO countries for far too long have basically comforted themselves with the fact that you had this American defense blanket. And that has been on the wane since the days of Barack Obama, when Obama made it very clear that he did not see America's role as being, as it has been in the past, the police officer of the world. And, there was clear evidence then and a clear indication to NATO countries then that they needed to start to step up with defence spending. And credit to the UK, I think we've more or less kept to that sort of spending limit. And even now, our generals, and I know they would say this, wouldn't they, are saying that we are not equipped to face, we hope never comes, but a more serious conflict with the Russians than we're already in. But nonetheless, the UK's defence spending has kept a pace with what the Americans would say is fair, and many others haven't. So that criticism, I think, is fair, but it was the added, and he just can't help himself, Trump, can he? It's that bloody, it's the performance and this cranking up of the crowd. And I'm with you, Jim. I think that there is, a not even a begrudging admiration of the way in which Putin is able to govern Russia. I think there's a lot in Trump and in Trump's camp who would absolutely love the fact that he could come in and, well, God forbid, but, absolutely damage American democracy to such an extent that we won't recognise the place.
Yes, and I, as I understand it, Biden's strategy is to make Trump the issue in the election rather than the economy.
Yeah, and I think, as I say, he was able to do that 4 years ago, and you've reminded everybody at very different times, campaigns from home. I think you said Joe Biden didn't leave the house. I don't think he left the basement of his house, from what I can remember. It was all team stuff, wasn't it? Zoom calls and all that sort of thing. You won't be able to get away with that this time. And I just think, listen, whatever your politics, I think you've got to say the guy is too old. And they've not got long to change horses. And they should be having those serious conversations now. Well, maybe they will be having. I don't know.
I mean, this conversation, was always in danger of becoming morbid or that sort of thing. But there must be some contingency plan. I mean, I don't know in the full constitutional position where a candidate, becomes incapable or too ill to run. Although I do know that for lesser positions in the United States, they have this extraordinary thing where someone can die during a campaign and still win the election. Because they, again, as Rochdale, they can't be taken off the ballot paper. But quite what would happen if something happened?
That might be the best option, Jim, this time around.
Something happened in October. There must be contingency plans in place.
The dead guy won.
The fear is that these governors of Nielsen, I think he's called in California, and the woman in Wisconsin just wouldn't be able to. You hinted at it. Of course, that presupposes some agreement as to who should succeed. Because the most likely thing is if Biden retired. Let's put it like that. Let's not deal with the more morbid possibility. If Biden retired, all hell would break loose in terms of the nomination, and all that would have to be sorted out. There isn't an outstanding person. I mean, normally the vice president would be looming up, but that doesn't seem to be the case.
No, it's worrying. It's worrying. But if they would all sort of swallow the pride and put their arms around her, then the obvious candidate, and she'd certainly get by backing, is Taylor Swift. But I think she's a bit busy with her concerts this year, so perhaps not. Perhaps a run at the White House in 2028. Though.
Well, of course, she's rumoured to going to be endorsing Biden.
She'll be reluctant to do it, Jim, won't she? For the very reasons we've discussed. I mean, she is well on the side of the policy initiatives of the Democrats, and she's been a great campaigner. On a serious note here, she's been a great campaigner around LGBTQ rights, and she's been a great campaigner around women's issues. But, as I say, even if you are so anti-Trump, as she clearly is from the public pronouncements she's made, do you really want to be getting behind Joe Biden's candidacy? I'm not sure. She might well do. But again, the time for that will be this week, won't it? On the back of their partner, or is he as mistress? What's the
master? What's
the right pronoun for a fella who's a mistress? I don't know. We won't go there, AJ.
Master,
but on the back of him winning the big Super Bowl trophy last night, then this week would be the best time for her to sort of nail her political colours to the mast. We will wait and see. But James, it's been another fascinating conversation. Thank you very much for your time. And, go and dust those Victorian dictionaries off and get yourself an up-to-date one so that we can have a narrative next week that's more 21st century than 19th. and listen, it's always interesting at this moment in time, the politics of our country. We've got some big elections coming up. Next week, we'll review what's happened in those two by-elections that we've been talking about today. We'll see what the fallout has been from the Rochdale debacle that, again, we've discussed earlier. And those statistics and economic measurements will be in. So we'll be reflecting on them as well. Parliament's in recess usually means it's going to be a bit quieter. But in 2024, don't bank on it. We'll see you next week in the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.